Hello, my name is Grant Van Vranken. Today I'm going to be talking to you about one of my favorite ancestors, a woman named Barbary Tope Penrod. She was born October 10th, 1799 in Warren County, Kentucky. Her father was Frederick Tope, who had been born at Carrollton Manor in Frederick County, Maryland. And her mother was a woman named Elizabeth Grammer, Betsy. They ended up living in Kentucky for about 10 to 15 years, and then they moved to Illinois. But before they moved to Illinois, Barbary actually got married to a man named John Penrod, who was from Somerset County, Pennsylvania. He was the son of Emmanuel Penrod and Fanny Long, who also would move to Illinois. And actually, Emmanuel Penrod and Frederick Tope together would build the first jail in Union County, Illinois in 1819, I believe it was. Pardon me. Anyway, they would go on to have 11 children between 1816 and 1842. Their oldest child was more than likely born in Kentucky because I don't think the family actually moves to Illinois until 1817 or 1818. Um, anyway, they would become early converts to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they would end up moving to Utah in the early 1850s. And this is a really cool picture of Melinda Tope Coleman, um, a much younger sister of Barbary, who was born in 1816 and died in 1895. So once they got to Illinois, John and Barbary bought and sold a few pieces of land. One of the biggest transactions they did was this 23 January 1836 transaction where John and Barbary sold 120 acres to her parents for $350. And Frederick and Elizabeth would end up selling it in November of the same year to Samson Keith for $450. And one of the really interesting things about that deed is a witness is Elvira Grammer, who in 1839 would end up marrying Frederick after Betsy died. And it's not sure for sure what Elvira's connection to Elizabeth is, but they were definitely related. Both had the same surname. I personally think they were either sisters or cousins, something along those lines. And she was much, much younger at the time when she married Frederick. And clearly, it was she was more of a caretaker than anything because he was quite an old man when they got married. Anyway, Barbary and her husband, John, converted to the Mormon faith, and her baptism took place April 5th, 1839. And she recalled that it was Jesse D. Hunter who actually baptized her. And the good thing is, because she was an early member of the church, she did write down a lot of information that otherwise nobody would have known. Um, so they wanted to move to be closer to the Mormons, so they sold their last farm that they had. It was 40 acres to his cousin and her sister. Barbary's sister, Polly, married Andrew Penrod, who was John's cousin. And um, they rented a farm in Nauvoo. But unfortunately, John got developed a fever and he would end up dying August 15th, 1843. And poor Barbary had 8 minor children at the time. So terrible timing, and the youngest child, Mary Elizabeth, was a year old and just walking, I think, when he died. And to make matters even worse, even though they had sold all their land and rented this farm, the estate was actually in debt. And I think they ended up being in debt like $150 negative after everything was sold and all that. So Barbary had to figure out ways to make money, and one of the things we know about her is that she was called a healer. Um, Her son, William Henry Harrison, would actually get the nickname Doc because he got the healing skills from her, and he actually used to ride around with her when she'd make house calls. And she was also a midwife. But she also purchased a still at the urging of her nephew, a guy named Val Sane, or who went by Sane. It was her brother John's son. Anyway, he told her it would be a good way to make money, and he helped her do it. Apparently, he was um, severely injured as a child. So the story goes, he slipped and fell on a scythe and like mangled his hand, and he was unable to use it for the rest of his life. But there's also records of Barbary being a caretaker of the poor in Jackson County, Illinois. And she also got paid to board Dr. Joel Grammer's horse, and he was her son Jacob's wife's father, but he was also a cousin of hers through the Grammer family. Not quite sure 100% how that relationship is. Unfortunately, some of the records just don't exist to verify it anymore. But Barbary was doing all of this trying to make extra money because she had made up her mind by this point. They were going to move. There was nothing holding them to Illinois at this point. So she was saving up money to move to Utah. And these are really neat. These, I believe, are actually in Barbary's handwriting because we do know she was literate, and her husband was not. Everything John Penrod signed was by Mark, but everything she signed was in her own hand, and it looks like this writing. And so, according to this, she wrote when her husband was born, which was July the 6th, 1791. She states she was born the 9th of October, 1799, and then lists her children Elizabeth, Hannah, Alan, Jacob, Willis. Um, then, unfortunately, she starts listing when people died, like her husband, August the 15th, 1843. But prior to that, her daughter Hannah had died on the 23rd of June, 1836, which was a devastating blow to the whole family. And then it lists Jacob's death, um, Sarah, Elizabeth, the daughter of Jacob, and Louisa, and her death. So the first child, like I said, was born most likely in Kentucky because I don't believe they'd moved to Illinois yet. Excuse me. And Elizabeth was born May 7th, 1816, and she wouldn't die until October 3rd, 1893. She married John O'Daniel April 8th, 1833, and they had one child that we know of for sure, and her name was Altisidora. She lived from 1833 to 1901. So the picture on the left is Elizabeth, and the picture on the right is her daughter, Altisidora. Her daughter Hannah, as I said, died June 23rd, 1836, after giving birth on March 17th, 1836. There were complications, and she never recovered. And I'm not exactly sure what happened, but somehow the daughter, Susanna Catherine Hagler, ended up being raised by her grandmother, Barbary, and would move to Utah with her as well. And this is a picture on the right of Susanna and her husband, Jesse Yancey. And there's a picture of them on the left as well, on their front porch at Lakeview, where they lived. So Alan Penrod was a young man who had fought in the Mexican American War and made his way back to the West after the war was over. And he would end up he was panning for gold at Dark Canyon, which is near Kelsey, California nowadays, and would end up getting shot in the back while panning for gold by an Indian. And he walked to the camp and told them what had happened and then died. So if he hadn't done that, nobody would have known who did it, but he was able to tell everybody what happened. So they actually captured the Indian, per his brother Emmanuel, and the Indian would try to escape, and he was shot by a guy named Thomas Wren, whose picture is down here on the right. And he would end up becoming a congressman for Nevada. So Allen had married and had two kids by the time he died, which was sad for them. They grew up without their father. And then the next child was Jacob, who is my direct ancestor. Jacob was born December 3rd, 1823, in either Jackson or Union County, Illinois. And he would end up dying July 17th, 1847, at Fort Leavenworth while en route to the Mexican American War. He had joined the 1st Illinois Regiment of Foot, and he was in Company H. But he had married a cousin of his, Louisa Ann Grammer, who was the daughter of Dr. Joel Grammer, and his first wife, Elizabeth Clapp. And Joel and Elizabeth had met in somewhere around Madison County, Alabama, which is where their first several children were born. And then they immigrated to Kentucky and then to Illinois. So Jacob and Louisa had two daughters that we know of, and one is only known because of the Bible record that showed Sarah Elizabeth died. And then Emma Caroline, who is my great great grandmother, was only a couple months old when her dad died of measles. And Emma would end up marrying Isaac Tweedy, and they together had my great grandfather, James Jacob Tweedy, who was a blacksmith in Wolf Lake, Illinois. And then she married Columbus Balance, who mainly went by CC, but his name was Christopher Columbus Balance. And he died in 1907. And then I found a newspaper article talking about how these people had reconnected. They were friends in grade or their local school back in probably the late 1850s or so, and they were both widowed at this point, so they reconnected and they got married, and that was Thomas B. Davis. They got married in 1908, and then he died in 1912. And the last mention I can find of Emma for sure is the 1910 census. Um, so I don't know when she died, and never been able to find her grave, will, record of her death, or anything, unfortunately. Pictures, nothing, which is incredibly surprising considering the era she lived. The next child is one of her most, well, definitely the most interesting child she had. His name was Emmanuel Penrod. He was named for his paternal grandfather, uh, also Emmanuel, who had been from Somerset County and had moved, or Somerset County, Pennsylvania, and had moved to Union County, Illinois, where he died in 1827. So Emmanuel was actually still alive when his grandson was born, who was named after him, which he probably got a kick out of. But anyway, this Emmanuel would end up just, he was such a colorful guy. You can't even make this stuff up. So on the bottom left there is a really bad quality picture of the Penrod Hotel or Penrod House, which was in, I want to say it was Virginia City, but it was apparently the first fireproof hotel west of the Mississippi. And everyone who was anyone passing through stayed there, including Mark Twain. And the quote at the top says, "A good supper, a cigar, something warm, and the certainty of a bed calmed the mind and gave satisfaction of having surmounted our difficulties." That's what Mark Twain wrote about staying at Emmanuel Penrod's hotel. But that is not why Emmanuel Penrod is famous. He's famous, well, I don't know if famous is the right word, but he was definitely pretty famous in his lifetime because he was one of the first partners that in the original discovery of the Comstock lode. However, he was, when I say early, he sold out early too and ended up not making nearly the kind of money. Like, he sold out all of his claims for, I don't know, $8,000, something like that, which, don't get me wrong, was a lot of money back then, but we're talking the Hearst fortune ended up coming from the Comstock lode, like millions of dollars. And honestly, I don't think he ever regretted it. And he was the only member of the Comstock lode that was able to actually attend the 50th anniversary, which, you know, he got to ride as VIP in the parade, which, I mean, you know, he had to have gotten a huge kick out of that. But anyway, he lived on the frontier. He was just saw and met some really, really cool people. Um, and I love his piercing blue eyes. I mean, they are just, those are not something you soon forget. I'm sure everyone that met him immediately saw those eyes and never forgot them. But anyway, he he ended up marrying Esper Anna Sides, who was the sister of Dr. Joel Grammer's second wife, Lydia. And it was at his urging that Dr. Grammer sold everything in Illinois and moved to Carson City, Nevada, where he would end up dying in 1861, I believe it was, with his second wife and their 4 or 5 kids, all of whom would end up dying childless. So Dr. Grammer's second family went extinct, and the only descendants come from his first wife, Elizabeth Clapp. The sixth child was John Grammer Penrod, who ended up becoming an attorney and he married a couple times. I believe he actually divorced his first wife and then quickly remarried another woman. And here's his picture, and he had a couple kids. Uh, his son Samuel lived until 1942. Oliver was the seventh child of John and Barbary, and this is such a neat but very sad picture. It's the three Olivers, three generations, and unfortunately, the youngest one didn't make it. He only lived to be four, and I'm sure this was a very, very sad picture for the family afterwards, but it's really neat that we have it. Oliver had quite a long life, and his son lived until 1952. And then the eighth child, Willis, was the only one that died in infancy. He was a year old or less when he died. The next child was William Henry Harrison Penrod, who's the one I said was called Doc. And he was born November 20th, 1836, and he wouldn't die until September 19th, 1922. And there was a story in the family that every other son of theirs played the fiddle, um, and he was one of the ones who did. And he married Lucine Bird Bybee, uh, whose brother would marry his sister Mary. So the 10th child, Singleton Tope Penrod, was born April 5th, 1839, and died the 9th of December, 1861, because of an avalanche that occurred in the Washoe Valley near Franktown. Um, Apparently, early in the morning hours, this huge avalanche came rushing through the valley, and it took three cabins with it. One of them happened to have Singleton sleeping inside. He was apparently helping build the railroad at the time. And his brother, John Grammer Penrod, wrote that it took them 7 days to find him, buried under the mud and sand. And it says, though not bruised near so bad as we expected, his face had a few scratches, his hands and feet was scratched some. His left leg was broken in 3 places, and a hole in the back of his head. We buried him the 9th day after he was killed. He did not have the appearance of a dead person. His eyes was closed when we found him. He was limber in all his joints, and the blood oozed out of his wounds. When we buried him, he was red in the face, was not swollen, no particular nor did not smell. If the skull had not been broken, there would have been a good many doubts about his being dead. Terribly sad. The last child was Mary Elizabeth Penrod, and she was born January 10th, 1842, and died September 22nd, 1922. And she married David Bowman Bybee, the sister of Lucine. Um, he was a polygamist, and she was his second wife of three. David would end up having 32 children. Um, Mary and David ended up getting married February 28th, 1857, and would have 10 children. They would end up having Barbary live with them. And the picture in the middle is Mary as an old woman. And then the picture on the right is Mary with her daughter, Mary Alice, on the far right. Her great granddaughter, Alice Patterson, is in the middle. Uh, and this must have been 1905-ish. because Alice Leone was born in 1904, and then her dad, Mary's grandson Alexander Patterson, is standing in the back. And then the picture on the far left is the children of Mary and David. In the back, left to right, it goes Hannah, John, Betsy, and Oliver, and then front, left to right, goes Byram, Parley, Clarence, Effie, and Mary. So Barbary Penrod, along with her children, Emmanuel, Doc, Singleton, Mary, Elizabeth, and her granddaughter Susanna, left on June 6, 1852 with the David Wood Company, heading for Utah. And one of the stories that got passed down is that one of their two horses pulling their, I would imagine, something akin to a Conestoga wagon, died. And being, in the middle of nowhere and not having any other option, they hooked up their milk cow in place of the dead horse, and they continued the rest of the way to Utah with a horse and a cow pulling their wagon. And Mary Elizabeth would later tell her children and grandchildren she walked the entire way. And I've heard a lot of stories about how uncomfortable it was for the people who did ride the wagon. Like they would only ever ride in the wagon when they absolutely had to, when they were driving it. You wouldn't want to ride in the back because it could actually, you could break bones. Like you were getting bounced around so much and getting hit by everything flying around. I'm sure it was just terrible. Um, anyway, they arrived just shy of 4 months later on October 1st, 1852. And it's actually noted in the newspaper when they arrive. And just a little bit after that, Barbary is in Provo City where she buys a lot for $20. And she lives there until January 17th, 1855, when she sold that lot for $30. And they moved around a lot after Provo. They moved to Bountiful, Ogden, Utah, um, various different places in Weber County. Um, and then, like I said, she ended up living with David Bowman Bybee and her daughter Mary Elizabeth in Mountain Green. And the reason why they lived there was David got an 80-acre patent for land there, and it was timberland, and they were building the railroad, so it worked out perfectly. He built sawmills and was making money left and right, and donated a quarter of an acre for a cemetery on the side of one of the hills that he owned, and later expanded it to 2 acres. And then the bridge at Devil's Gate going over the Weber River uh, washed out, and he bid with the county to build a new one, and he was, I guess, the lowest bidder. So he got to build the new one, and as part of building the new bridge, the county decided that they were going to put a toll there, a toll house, little cabin, and they were going to man it with somebody. And so, just like government stuff today, they put it out to bid, and Barbary Penrod, age 72, spoke for the job and was accepted. And she lived in this little cabin right by the new bridge over the river at Devil's Gate. And this is the obvious, I don't even know how to describe it. This is the coolest genealogical find I've ever come across. So I was doing some research on her when we were gonna go down to Salt Lake City in June of 2023 for a Matchbox 20 concert, and we are gonna go to do a few other things while we're there. And since I knew she had moved to Utah, I wanted to see if there was anything I could see while I was there. And I came across a really, really blurry picture of it was the one on the left, but it was so blurry you could basically only make out that her eyes were almost white. So I knew immediately that it this was important because of the pictures I'd seen of Emmanuel who had the very same eyes. And you could tell this was a very close relative of his. So I kept looking and I kept looking and I did a Google reverse image search. And I came across this stereograph listed on the Oregon Historical Society website of this 1873 stereograph taken by Carlton E. Watkins, who's a pretty famous Western photographer. And it, first of all, having a picture of an ancestor born before 1800 is very, very rare. So I was ecstatic. I was literally giddy like a school kid. But having two pictures, a stereograph, as they call it, but not only that, but these are such high quality. They're almost digital quality. I actually have this printed out on metal in my living room on a big metal print of this picture. It's fantastic. It looks even better blown up. So, like I said, she spoke for the job and was accepted. And this isn't the cabin that she lived in, but it was, probably not too different than what she did live in. And every toll wagon team that came across, team in a wagon, was a 50-cent toll. And the only protection she had was a hatchet. And family stories that were written down and are on familysearch.org under memories under Barbary state that a transient broke in and, quote, grabbing the hatchet, she hit him. And after the episode, she said the only animal she was afraid of was the two-legged kind. And there were two different versions of what happened afterwards. She either walked to the nearest neighbor or to her family. Either way, she thought she'd killed him, and apparently she hadn't. She just seriously injured him, and they pulled him out. And I'm not sure if she how long after that she actually did this, because she was pretty old by this point, and being out in the middle of a canyon all by yourself, especially where Devil's Gate. And I think there was even a story where she said she saw the devil on the bridge one night. But anyway, Barbary would end up dying January 25th, 1878. And she had written a will just prior to that. And her will was dated November 17th, 1877. And you got to remember, she'd been widowed since August of 1843. And at this time, she wrote, I, Barbary Penrod of Easton Precinct, widow of the late John Penrod. So she'd been a widow 35 years or so, and she mentions her late husband. Anyway, she left everything. She left her son, Doc, her houses and lands. She gave her daughter Mary all her furniture. She gave Oliver all of her livestock, and Oliver and Mary were to get all of her notes, credits, and valuable papers. And anyway, she died shortly after that, and someone in Illinois actually still has a letter, or there might be more than one, but I've only been able to find a transcription of one of them that Barbary wrote to her oldest daughter in 1854 from Provo City, Utah. And one of the things I love about some of these old letters is when they talk about the cost of everyday items. And she does in this. Barbary says, I am wearing jeans, 25 cents per yard, linsey and flannel, 1 shilling per yard. And she says, pure water and pure air, cool nights and warm days. Um, she says, I hope you will tell John if he wants to go to the gold mines to come on, for there is a gold mine found 200 miles before you get to the Great Salt Lake Valley. Some emigrant stopped there and is making $10 to $12 per day. She mentions David Penrod lives there, A.D. Boren, Coleman and Beverly Boren live in Provo near her. She wrote to Callie Forey to take the house and hasn't received any answer as of yet. She asks for a manual to write to her and let her know how both he and John are doing. And she apparently sent part of a letter to Mary Vansel, who was a cousin of the Penrods. And it's interesting to note that Barbary was literate because her father was not, her mother was not, her husband was not, and at least some of her siblings were not, from what I can tell. So I'm not exactly sure how she got educated or why, but she did educate her children. And from all accounts, her paternal grandfather, Jacob, who lived at Carrollton Manor, he was literate as well, as were at least his one brother, George, and his uncle, Nicholas, and his cousin, Jacob, were all able to sign their own names at least, as well as possibly the great grandfather, Caspar Taube, might have also been able to write. So that was pretty rare back then for that many generations to be skipped over for literacy. But anyway, when we did travel to Utah in June of 2023, we stopped at Mountain Green, and little tiny cemetery on the side of a hill, but looking around, it was one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. Mountains, big sky, beautiful green valley down below, trees, and it was just so peaceful. I would imagine that when they picked the spot for this cemetery, they all had to have been like, I'd want to spend eternity here because it's just beautiful. And it is. So, and then there's a picture on the right there of my sons, Alex on the left, Aaron in the middle, and I'm on the right. And I'm holding the a printout of the stereograph of Barbary that I brought with us. And somebody had put flowers on her grave recently, and it appears that somebody visits it regularly, which I think is fantastic. And I'm sure she'd be tickled pink to know that somebody is still thinking of her all these years later.